Recently, I made a video about faithfulness between men and women in medieval marriages. And one of the things I pointed out in this video was the fact that chastity belts did not exist in the Middle Ages. The idea that these were used in the medieval era is a myth. They did not exist. And one interesting thing that was coming up in the comments, some people were saying, okay, well, how do I know that you're telling the truth about this? And I have to say, I found this kind of interesting because I have never in my life watched a YouTube video and wondered if what the person was saying was true or not, and then reacted by commenting under their video, well, I mean, are you lying to me? How do I know you're telling the truth? So I thought it might be interesting to just go ahead and do a video about this. How do we determine whether or not something is true in history? Whenever I come across a claim that I'm curious about, I'm not sure whether or not it's true, one of my first reactions, and I think this is probably how a lot of people react, is I do an internet search for it. Now, if you're searching for a topic on the internet, you're just doing a broad internet search for something, I mean, this is not going to give you definitive information. But what this is going to do is give you a general idea of the chatter on a particular topic. I mean, just broadly, what are people saying about this? And in particular, this is helpful for something like chastity belts in the Middle Ages, because if you just do an internet search for did chastity belts exist in the Middle Ages, you will immediately get all sorts of hits in which people are saying exactly what I'm saying. The first thing that comes up, in fact, is an article from the Smithsonian. The title is "Medieval Chastity Belts Were a Myth." And after that, there's an article from a guy named Clausen, who is a scholar, who's a high-level medieval scholar. And he wrote a book called The Medieval Chastity Belt, A Myth-Making Process. And this is just an article, discussing his book and, his research on this. So to me, this just seems like the logical thing to do. I mean, you're confronted with a claim on the internet. Wouldn't your first reaction be to just do a quick internet search and see what other people are saying? Okay, so an internet search can be a first step on your journey toward knowledge. But the next step obviously is going to be looking at what the scholars say. So how do we know anything at all about the past? How do we know what happened in the Middle Ages? We have to look at the source material. We have to look at our evidence. And what constitutes valid evidence for a particular topic, from medieval history? Like, let's say the Knights Templar. Is a novel written in the 90s by a sci-fi guru, is that evidence for the Knights Templar, or good evidence about the Knights Templar? No. How about an exchange of letters between the first Grand Master of the Knights Templar and Saint Bernard of Clairvaux in the mid-12th century? Yes, that would constitute valid evidence for the history of the Knights Templar. So who can look at this sort of material? Who can evaluate this evidence? Scholars of medieval history. These are people who have spent their lives looking at this material, analyzing it, studying it, researching it. And they compare their work with the work of other scholars. I'm sure there are areas in academia today where maybe you would not be able to get very good information about a particular topic, but when it comes to medieval history, the scholarly world is very healthy right now. I think sometimes when you're first getting into something like the history of the Middle Ages, you might not necessarily know what to expect. I mean, I remember very early on when I was first getting into this, you ask yourself, okay, well, what's a good book on this topic? How do I find something that's reliable? But you start picking up scholarly works. You start reading some of the leading voices in a particular field. Like the Crusades, for example. I mean, I started reading people like Jonathan Riley Smith, Jonathan Phillips, Christopher Tyerman, and you start looking at their work. You look at the source material yourself. I mean, one thing you can do also is go back and look at some of the primary sources, the chronicles, the writings from the Middle Ages about a particular historical topic, and you can start evaluating the work a little bit for yourself. So how do scholars evaluate source material? Well, let's take one sort of example, chronicles. These were works of history produced in the Middle Ages by medieval authors. So if we take an event like the First Crusade, we've got an abundance of source material of this kind. We've got Fulcher of Chartres, who was a priest who was in the retinue of Baldwin of Boulogne. He wrote an account of the First Crusade. We've got the Gesta Francorum, which was written by a Norman follower of Bohemund of Taranto. This gives us more of a Norman perspective. We've got Albert of Aachen, who was writing more from the accounts of eyewitnesses that he was talking to. We've got Byzantine perspectives. We have Anna Komnena. She was a Byzantine princess who wrote an account of the First Crusade, so we can look at what she said. We've got Ibn al-Qalanisi. He was a Muslim writer. This was a guy from Damascus who wrote about the First Crusade. He lived at the time that it was going on. So we can see here that we get a lot just from this one category of source material, and there are many other categories as well. We've got a lot of information to sift through. Now, all of these accounts, they have their biases, they have their particular perspectives, but what's fascinating is when you can see them confirm each other. You know, broadly, all of these authors I just mentioned do describe the same things, the same course of events in the First Crusade, and this is powerful information, this is powerful evidence, and this gives historians a pretty good idea of what was going on in the First Crusade. I don't recall. Now, when it comes to something like chastity belts, the thing that scholars have been pointing out is just that there's no evidence that these things existed. You know, you go back to, source material for the Middle Ages, whether it's archaeology or written sources, there's just nothing there. These things aren't there. All the information we have about these things comes from recent history, from modern history, the 19th century. And this brings me to another comment that was popping up here and there on this video, and that was people were saying, okay, well, I've seen one in a museum. I've seen a chastity belt in a museum. And, this proves nothing. Just because you see an item in a museum and it's labeled chastity belt, or even if it's labeled medieval chastity belt, that doesn't mean you're looking at an artifact from the Middle Ages. It could very well be something from the modern era. And in fact, in particular with chastity belts, this has been a thing. There have been many embarrassing episodes for museums in which some medieval scholar walked in and looked at something that was labeled, chastity belt from the Middle Ages and said, this is not a medieval chastity belt, this is not a medieval anything. And it had to be taken down, and this was a big embarrassing thing. So yeah, this is not evidence for anything. So after you've gotten familiar with various scholars of medieval history and looked at their work, the next step, of course, is you can look at the source material for yourself. You could learn Latin or Old French or Arabic or Greek or whatever other language you might need for your particular area of interest. And you can go back and look at some of the original source material. You can go into museums and archives and look at it yourself. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'd like to say a quick thanks to Little Sasquatch on YouTube, who left a comment this morning on a video saying they had received my book in the mail and were starting to read it and they are enjoying it. Thanks very much for that, Little Sasquatch. Also, I'd like to say a thanks to all of my Patreon supporters. Today is Patron Appreciation Day. Thank you so much for your support. I could not do what I do without you guys. And to everybody else, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. I will talk to you soon.